The room was a symphony of quiet, punctuated only by the gentle clinking of ice against crystal and the low, deliberate hum of curated conversation. It was the kind of Washington, D.C. fundraiser where power didn't need to shout. It simply existed, a palpable force in the room. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of designer gowns and impeccably tailored suits. Here, the currency was influence, and the exchange rate was a well-placed word or a knowing glance. The event, a benefit for a children's literacy program, was ostensibly nonpartisan, a gathering of the city's elite beneath a banner of shared humanity. But in the current climate, with the political landscape more fractured than ever, every gathering was a minefield, and every guest was a potential story. Michelle Obama stood near the grand piano, a vision of poised elegance in a deep emerald gown that seemed to absorb the light and radiate it back as warmth. She was holding court, not in the aggressive alpha way of the political set, but with a genuine curiosity that drew people in. She listened intently to a young poet laureate from the Midwest, her head tilted, a smile playing on her lips that could light up a stadium. Around her, a small crowd had gathered, not just the usual sycophants, but people who were genuinely starstruck, drawn to the gravity of her presence. She was no longer the First Lady, but in many ways she was more powerful than ever, an icon of grace, intelligence, and unassailable dignity. Across the sprawling ballroom, near the entrance to the library, a different energy crackled. Ivanka Trump, radiant in a sleek, nude-toned sheath dress that was unmistakably couture, was navigating the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been in the spotlight since birth. She smiled, shook hands, and exchanged pleasantries, her voice a low, modulated tone designed to soothe and disarm. She was here representing the family business, the Trump Organization, which had made a substantial donation to the cause. But more than that, she was here to rehabilitate, to remind the D.C. establishment that there was a softer side to the Trump brand, one that cared about policy, about children, about the future. She was the bridge, or so the narrative went, the reasonable one who could speak the language of the elite while still carrying the family flag. The two women had crossed paths before, of course, at official functions, at transitions of power. Their encounters had always been the subject of intense scrutiny, each handshake and smile dissected for hidden meaning. But those meetings were governed by protocol, the stiff choreography of state. Tonight was different. Tonight was neutral territory, a social event where the armor of office was replaced by the more subtle armor of personal brand. The incident that would shatter the evening's carefully constructed calm began not with a shout, but with a whisper. A junior aide from Ivanka's small entourage, a young man named Chad, had been hovering near the bar, scrolling through his phone. He was tasked with monitoring social media, a 21st century spin doctor's job. A look of alarm crossed his face. He excused himself from a conversation and navigated the crowd to Ivanka's side, leaning in to whisper urgently in her ear. Ivanka's smile flickered just for a millisecond. She excused herself from the elderly senator she was charming and stepped aside with Chad. On his phone was a post from her father's Twitter account, a video that had been up for just over 10 minutes but was already going viral. The video was a crude AI-generated piece of propaganda that began with a serious-looking graphic about election integrity, but devolved into a grotesque caricature, ending with the faces of Barack and Michelle Obama grotesquely superimposed onto the bodies of primates swaying to circus music. It was a dog whistle of the highest order, a racist trope as old as the nation itself, and it had just been amplified by the President of the United States. Ivanka's face, for a brief moment, was a canvas of conflicting emotions. There was a flash of pure, unadulterated mortification, quickly suppressed. Then came the cold, hard steel of political calculation. This was a disaster, a self-inflicted wound right in the middle of her delicate charm offensive. She handed the phone back to Chad, her expression smoothing over into a placid, if slightly strained mask. "What do I do?" Chad whispered, his eyes wide. "The press is already asking for comment."
"Nothing," Ivanka murmured, her voice barely audible. "We're here for the children. We say nothing. It wasn't us. It was an errant post. We'll deal with it later." She turned back to the room, her smile back in place, but it was a brittle thing now, like glass that had been stressed and was ready to shatter. But the news was like a ripple in a pond, spreading outward from Ivanka's corner. People were checking their phones, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Murmurs began to surface, cutting through the polite hum of the party. The phrase, "Did you see what he posted?" was whispered from group to group. Michelle Obama, mid-conversation with the poet, noticed the shift in the room's energy. She saw the glances towards Ivanka, the furtive phone checks. Her own chief of staff, Melissa, a woman who had been with her for over a decade, approached quietly and handed her a phone. Michelle glanced at the screen. Her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at it, her eyes absorbing the ugly pixels, and then handed the phone back. She took a slow, deep breath, the kind of breath she might take before a difficult workout. Then she excused herself from the poet with a gentle touch on the arm and a promise to continue their conversation later. The room seemed to sense a shift in the atmospheric pressure. Conversations didn't stop, but they lost their steam. Eyes darted towards the two women. Michelle began to move, not towards Ivanka, but towards the terrace doors, a slow, deliberate path that would take her near the group where Ivanka was standing. It was a masterclass in non-confrontational navigation, or so it seemed. As Michelle passed, a well-meaning but socially inept donor, a man named Arthur who had made his fortune in plastics, reached out to touch her arm. "Mrs. Obama," he said, his voice a little too loud in the suddenly quiet space, "I am so sorry. It's absolutely disgusting, just vile. I can't believe the utter lack of decency coming from that—" He trailed off, his eyes involuntarily flickering towards Ivanka, who was standing just a few feet away, her back ramrod straight. The comment hung in the air, a verbal hand grenade with the pin pulled. Arthur's wife, a woman in a terrifyingly bright pink dress, looked like she wanted to disappear into the marble floor. This was the moment the evening's fragile peace could either be restored or irrevocably broken. Ivanka could have pretended not to hear. She could have taken the out, used the cover of the murmuring crowd to slip away to the restroom and regroup. That was the playbook: deflect, distract, disappear. But something in her snapped. Maybe it was the accumulated pressure of being the family's shield, the exhaustion of constantly defending the indefensible. Maybe it was the humiliation of seeing her father's worst instincts laid bare for this exact audience. Or maybe it was the perceived slight, the fact that no one, not a single person in this room, seemed to be extending her the same grace, the same benefit of the doubt. She was being judged by association, and she was tired of it. She turned, her movement sharp and deliberate. She looked not at Arthur, the hapless messenger, but directly at Michelle Obama, who had paused at the interruption. "I'm sure, Mrs. Obama, that you, of all people, understand the difference between a staff error and a family's heart. My father has a lot of people managing his account. Mistakes happen." The room collectively held their breath. People nearby froze, their drinks halfway to their lips. It was a defense of sorts, but it was also an accusation. It was a demand to be separated from her father's actions, to be judged on her own merit.
Michelle Obama stopped fully now. She turned to face Ivanka. The silence in that corner of the ballroom was now absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck all the sound out of the world. For a long, drawn-out second, she just looked at Ivanka. It wasn't an angry look or a pitying one. It was a look of deep, profound assessment, as if she were seeing Ivanka clearly for the very first time. When she spoke, her voice was low, calm, and utterly devoid of the theatricality that defined political discourse. It was the voice of a woman who had been scrutinized, vilified, and underestimated for years, and who had emerged with a core of steel. "I understand many things, Ivanka," she said, her voice so quiet that people leaned in to hear, creating a strange, tight circle around the two women. "I understand what it is to have your husband's legacy attacked. I understand what it is to have your children targeted by a public that can be cruel. I understand what it is to walk into a room where half the people think you don't belong." She took one small step closer. No one moved to stop her. No one could. "But I also understand what it is to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that my husband would never, ever use the most racist, degrading imagery in American history to attack his predecessor. I understand what it is to know that he would never belittle a Gold Star family, or mock a reporter with a disability, or brag about assaulting women." Her eyes didn't leave Ivanka's. "That is not a staff error, Ivanka. That is a fundamental failure of character. And a staff error doesn't become a presidential post unless the man in the Oval Office approves of the message. We both know that." The words landed like stones in a still pond, each one sending out a shock wave. Arthur, the plastics millionaire, looked like he might faint. His wife had a hand over her mouth. A congressman from Illinois slowly lowered his highball glass to a nearby table, the clink deafening in the quiet. Ivanka's face had gone pale. The practiced smile was gone, replaced by a stark, frozen expression. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time in her adult life, in the public eye, she was utterly speechless. She had been confronted not with anger, which she could handle, but with a calm, devastating truth that left no room for political maneuver. Michelle hadn't attacked her. She had simply drawn an undeniable line between the world Ivanka wanted to inhabit and the world her father actually created. Michelle continued, her voice softening, not with sympathy, but with a kind of sorrowful finality. "I don't envy the position you're in. I can't imagine the cognitive dissonance it takes to be here, tonight, talking about children's literacy, while your father is busy feeding a different kind of poison to the country. But I will not stand here and have you suggest that this is a simple misunderstanding, a mix-up in the social media office. It is not, and you know it is not." She let the silence hang for a beat longer, her gaze unwavering. Then, with the dignity that seemed to fill the entire room, she simply said, "Now, if you'll excuse me, I was having a lovely conversation with a remarkable young poet, and I'd like to get back to it." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, turned and walked away. The room remained silent. It wasn't the silence of shock alone, but the silence of a profound truth settling into the space. Every eye was on Ivanka, who stood frozen, a solitary figure in couture dress, stripped of her armor, her talking points useless. She looked around as if searching for an ally, a friendly face, a lifeline. She found none. The guests, for the most part, averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by the carpet, the ceiling, their empty champagne flutes. The social machinery that usually rushed to fill an awkward silence was stalled, broken by the sheer power of what they had just witnessed. Chad, the aide, materialized at Ivanka's side, his face ashen. "Ivanka, we should go," he whispered urgently.
She didn't resist. She let him take her elbow and guide her towards the exit, her steps unsteady in her designer heels. She didn't say goodbye to the host. She didn't make her rounds. She simply disappeared through the gilded doors and into the DC night. The moment the doors closed behind her, the room didn't erupt, but it thrummed. A low, intense buzz of whispered conversation filled the space. People leaned into each other. Phones were out, thumbs flying across screens. The story was no longer about the president's racist video. It was about what Michelle Obama had said. It was about the dressing down heard round the world. It was about the moment the room fell silent. Back by the piano, Michelle Obama rejoined the young poet. "I'm so sorry for the interruption," she said, her voice warm and genuine once more. "You were saying about the role of community in your work." She was utterly composed. It was as if the confrontation had been a mild detour, a momentary distraction from the real business of the evening. This, perhaps, was the most powerful thing of all. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't issued a press release. She had simply spoken the truth, and in doing so, had shifted the tectonic plates of the room. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The silent room clip, of course, didn't exist on video, but the eyewitness accounts were legion. By morning, the story dominated every news cycle. Cable news pundits dissected it frame by imagined frame. Social media exploded with the hashtag #RoomWentSilent. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The president's pathetic, racist dog whistle was completely overshadowed by the story of Michelle Obama's effortless, devastating takedown of her daughter. Ivanka's camp tried to spin it. Sources close to Ivanka leaked that she had been visibly shaken by the unprovoked attack from Mrs. Obama. They tried to paint Michelle as the aggressor, the bully, but the narrative wouldn't stick. Too many people in that room, people with credibility, whispered the truth. Ivanka stepped to Michelle. She had tried to play the game, and she had lost, badly.
For the Obamas, the incident became yet another data point in their post-White House lives. Barack called Michelle from wherever he was, a knowing smile in his voice. "I hear you made quite an impression at the fundraiser." She just laughed, a soft, tired sound. "I just told the truth, Barack. Someone had to." The true fallout was more profound. In the weeks that followed, Ivanka's public appearances became less frequent. The carefully curated Instagram feed, once a bastion of aspirational family life and policy-wonk glamour, grew quieter. The West Wing adjacents who had whispered about her future political ambitions went silent. The path she had been carefully paving, the one that led away from her father's worst impulses and towards her own independent brand, had been blockaded, not by her father's enemies, but by the simple, unassailable truth of who her father was and what he stood for. And in political and social circles across the country, the story became legend. It was a cautionary tale about the limits of spin, the power of quiet dignity, and the moment when a room full of the most powerful people in the world fell silent, not because they were shocked by a scandal, but because they were witnessing something far more rare, accountability, delivered with the impeccable grace of Michelle Obama. It was a shutdown that wasn't a shout, but a whisper that echoed louder than any scream, a moment that defined not just an evening, but an era.